Right, good evening everybody, thanks very much for coming. Myself and the speaker have just arrived and we're already straight in to go.
Yep.
So yes, we've invited this evening, this is Dr. Anthony Joseph.
It's me.
And I believe you're still president of the
I'm still president of the Jewish Genealogical Society of Great Britain.
That's right.
Till next month.
All right. But we have a mutual friend. This is how I found out. First time I've met Anthony, but we have a mutual friend who's Anne Dawes, one of our members, who we've both known Anne for a long time. And Anne suggested the idea of having this meeting this evening, and I was very keen about the idea. I'm always interested in finding out more about different faith groups. That's a reasonable expression, I suppose, to use. Religions. I've got various things I think I know about Judaism, but we're probably wrong. So I have a chance to ask Anthony after the break, especially in relation to the history of Jewish people in Britain, which is the topic of tonight's talk. Okay, thanks very much, Anthony.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. I use this machine, do I? Yes. Well, thank you very much. Firstly, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful to you. I can't remember how long I was supposed to speak for, but if there's any problems about the time going by and you all start worrying, as long as there's a calendar in the room, we won't be doing too badly. I wouldn't overdo that. One or two sort of introductory remarks. I'm neither a historian nor a religious member of the Jewish community. I am a member of the Jewish community, but I have very little religious faith. In fact, I have no religious faith of any sort, so I'll probably share your views as far as that's concerned. Being Jewish is a strange mixture. It's a bit like defining it is quite difficult. One definition I rather like is someone who never buys retail. Another one is Jews are like other people, only more so. You know what it looks like when you see it, like an elephant, but actually describing it is a bit hard because it's a mixture of ethnicity, faith grouping, what you feel yourself about yourself, and so forth. I'm also very pleased that tonight one of my long-standing friends, Abe, is in the audience, but also petrified because he knows a damn sight more than I do about some of these things, and he'll put me right in no uncertain. I'll probably report me to my rabbi, even though we both share a similar feeling about the actual faith grouping. Right, now the reason I got interested really is purely ethnic. You can look at this if you like later. There's a family tree of myself and going backwards for about 350 years in this country, which is quite unusual for Jewish people. The Jews resettled in 1656, and we'll have a bit more to say about that later, but very few members of the present Jewish community anywhere in Britain can trace their ancestry back in England for 350 years. I learnt that I could do fairly early in the piece, and this is what really sparked my interest is in the genealogical aspects of this world. And in order to trace my background and so forth, it was quite necessary to study the Jewish sources because most of my ancestors, not exclusively, most of my ancestors are Jewish. However, going back to the definition of a Jew, it really is quite difficult. It is said you're a Jew if you have a Jewish mother. Well, why is she Jewish? Because she had a Jewish mother, and so ad infinitum. And there comes a point when you can not really quite work out where to come from. Now, it so happens in my own ancestral background, my mother's mother's mother, all on the maternal line, was born in Kidderminster. She was the 11th child of 13, and she was the daughter of a local pork butcher. This always excites my wife. So, if you argue these things by the strictest of rules, since my maternal ancestry goes back to Gentile roots, maybe I'm not Jewish after all. However, my great-grandmother, who I just remember, I was about 3 when she died, she converted. She came into service in her early teens. I say she was the 11th of 13 children. They were not a wealthy family. She came into service to an immigrant Lithuanian Jewish family in Birmingham in the 1880s, and after 5 years, from the age of 13 to 18, her future father-in-law said to her, look, I think you should, said to his son that you should marry this girl. She's got used to our ways. She'll be a good wife and it'll work well for you. And indeed, that's what happened, and she converted. She underwent an Orthodox conversion, And she became much more practicing of the faith than any of the rest of us have been for the next 3 generations. She had rather a sad life, just very briefly, in that after 20 years of happy marriage, her husband, my great-grandfather, he had a market stall in what is now round the Bull Ring, and he was on his way down to his stall one day to work in one morning in the middle of June, and he saw a kid running in the road, a 2-3-year-old kid was running in the road, and there was a runaway horse and carriage which was imminently likely to run him over. My great-grandfather rescued the child and flung the kid to the side of the road. Unfortunately, he was hit by the horse and carriage and he died of a fractured skull that night. He was only in his early 40s. He left his widow, the convert to Judaism, and 10 children, of whom my grandmother was the second oldest. My grandmother was then 17. Her youngest brother was 1. She used to help her father in the market store, and she went down to work to help her, not knowing anything about this. And there was a knot of people outside what became the Accident Hospital, was then the Queen's Hospital in Holloway Head. What's going on? She saw a collar in the road, and the collar was her father's. And somebody said, "Haven't you heard? There's been a terrible accident." Of course, she found out. She lived to be 92, so she didn't do too badly. And she helped her. She ran the business for her, took over from her father, demanded no favours of the traders, none about. And we just had a sort of rather a dose of feminism this week with somebody who's recently died in high positions. Well, my grandmother was long before all that, but she just got on with the job and managed in a man's world and made a very successful business, and all her brothers got good education. I'll have occasion to mention some of the other descendants because they may be known to you because of their work and so on in Birmingham. Anyway, that's the background of why I sort of got interested, and because most of my family roots are Jewish, that's why I started taking an interest in all these things. And I'm going to tell you a bit now about what I know of the structure of the Jewish peoplehood and community in Britain. Now, the first thing is, we don't know when the first Jew came to Britain. Legend has it that Joseph of Arimathea, who lived at the time of Jesus of Nazareth, settled in Cornwall. It may be, it may be not. It's legend. There may have been the odd Jew come with the Romans and help build the roads or something of that sort. Again, we don't know. It's completely obscure, precisely. The first known community was medieval. The structure was a bit like this. William of Normandy, who defeated Harold at the Battle of Hastings and set up his court and became William I. In Normandy, there are a whole group of Jewish financiers, court financiers, who helped him raise funds for wars and this sort of thing. And many of these people came to Britain and continued the same sort of trading in finance, the infrastructure of the financial community that they did in Normandy. So the first known Jewish community was medieval. Now, sometimes somebody gets, not in an audience like yourselves, but if I'm talking to a Jewish audience or where there's people maybe, that someone will get up and say, "I think I may be descended from one of those Jews who came to If they really seriously think that, I have the melancholy task of disillusioning them. The community flourished for about 2.5 centuries, and it mostly flourished. Yes, there were some occasional unpleasant episodes. Clifford's Tower in York in 1189, where the Jews were put to death. The legend of Hugh of Lincoln. It is alleged that the Jews used to slaughter Christian children at the time of the Passover because so they could use their blood to sprinkle on the unleavened bread, the matzah. These sort of the so-called blood libel, these sorts of legends, occasionally things got a bit nasty. But in general, most people couldn't really care a toss, to use a modern idiom. They just got on with their medieval lives and let the kings and the noblemen fight over the money and all this sort of thing. And the Jewish communities flourished. And occasionally, things, about 20 years ago, where an old synagogue somewhere near Guildford was unearthed, and the medievalists got very excited about what they found. And then somewhere near Bristol, there was a mikveh. Many of you probably don't know what a mikveh is. It's a ritual bath. If you're an Orthodox Jew, you're supposed to, the males are supposed to go there on Friday afternoon to purify themselves before the Sabbath. The ladies are supposed to go every month, mid-cycle between their periods, to purify themselves. They're supposed to have a time of no cohabitation between the end of the period and halfway through. Then they go to the mikveh, purify themselves, and then it's no holds barred. And it's not surprising, if you think of the fertility cycle, it's not surprising why the Orthodox Jews then have so many children, because it's a fertility ritual that's been dressed up into a nice little theological justification. Anyway, the mikveh was the ritual bath where all this happened. And say one was discovered near Bristol, maybe about 20 years ago, and caused a lot of, again, excitement in the medievalists and this sort of thing. So the medieval community flourished for this time until about the middle of the 13th century. Then things did go, not quite, they went a little bit more pear-shaped. They probably couldn't raise enough money for the various wars, the 100 Years' War and this sort of thing. And they did have difficulty in fighting off persecution and so forth. Matters came to a head in August 1290 with the Edict of Expulsion of Edward I. Edward I banished the Jews from the realm as a final act. He actually offered them three choices. They could be forcibly baptized, they could be put to death, or they could flee the country. It's remarkable how many of them chose death. Quite a number of them chose to be forcibly put to death. Those that fled the country might well have been chosen death because the boats were unseaworthy and they capsized outside Calais or somewhere in the English Channel, and the community effectively completely perished. This is why I say there are no known descendants, or no way, even with modern DNA profiling and the rest of it, there's no way that anybody can trace their ancestry in a legitimate sense, in a genealogical sense, back to the medieval Jewish community. It came to an end. Interestingly, or not, depending on how you see these things, the date upon the Edict of Expulsion of August the 1st, 1290, is a Jewish festival, isn't quite the right word. It's a commemoration day. It is called Tisha B'Av. The month of Av is that time of the year. Tisha B'Av was the commemoration of the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, 70 AD, or CE, whichever version of life you choose to go by. That the Edict of Expulsion ironically occurred on Tisha B'Av in 1290 is a minor footnote in Jewish history. Right, we now reach the period of the so-called interregnum between 1290 and 1656, the resettlement date, which I'm going to refer to in a bit more detail. There were no Jews living in Britain, at least not officially. Certainly they were banned from the realm, although it's only the Jews who were living in 1290 who were banned from the realm. In modern times, the late and perhaps unlamented Oswald Mosley tried to reenact, when he was promoting anti-Semitic, the black shirts and so forth in the East End of London, he tried to reenact the Edict of Expulsion, saying, well, the Jews living here, they're not legally allowed here. They were kicked out in 1290. They shouldn't be here. But he was defeated on two grounds. One is that the edict only applied to those Jews who were living in 1290, and although Jewish longevity is a bit mythical, I don't think anyone could seriously claim to have lived here from 1290 to 1930, whatever it was. So the other thing is, Britain has a rather interesting way of dealing with these matters. We have case law and we have statute law. Now, case law has overwhelmingly been in favour of the Jews in the past 3.5 centuries. They can hold land, they can vote, they can be indulged in business and so forth. And even if there was some justification for the 1290 statute, which is still on the statute book, it's never been repealed, it hasn't needed to be, it wouldn't wash because of case law. So Mosley didn't get very far, though he did try quite hard. His son has been much more notorious recently, even having Nazi orgies and so forth. So the family is quite interesting in its own right. He was also the MP for Smethwick, which is where I worked for many years, so though he had ceased to be MP long before my time. Anyway, officially, between 1290 and the resettlement date, Jews were not living in Britain and not allowed to. In reality, a few Jews here and there were living. A particularly well-known case was a man called Sir Edward Brampton, who was active at the time of the Wars of the Roses. He was a companion of Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck. His real name was Edvardo Brandão, and he was a Portuguese Jewish adventurer. but in English he was known as Edward Brampton. One or two people of this sort have coloured the period between 1290 and the resettlement time. But things actually started to get moving more effectively in the late 1580s, in Elizabethan times, when various Jewish merchants used to trade with Britain, and some actually came to settle in Britain. Officially, they were Christian, but in reality, they practiced their Jewish rituals. They were known as Moranos, which is not a particularly pleasant word. It means pigs. A rather nicer word is conversos. They were converted, but they weren't really converted. When a character called Manasseh ben Israel, a Jew from Spain originally, but living in Holland, in Amsterdam, when he petitioned Cromwell to allow the Jews to resettle and continue, it was basically for trade reasons rather than theological reasons or for individual freedom reasons. Trade with Amsterdam was important, and the Jewish community were trading vigorously. Cromwell was quite a hard-headed realist. He had his own theological wrinkles, one of which was that he thought that if it said somewhere in the scriptures that if the Jews were dispersed to all the four corners of the earth, the second coming of the Messiah would happen. So he thought, I'll do my bit, we'll have them back in Britain, and that's getting towards it. Of course, from the Jewish perspective, the first coming hadn't happened either, but then nobody argued with Cromwell on those sort of grounds. They just said, well, if you'll let us be here, we'll be here. Cromwell didn't actually officially tear up the Edict of Expulsion of 1290, but what he assured the Jewish leaders, Manasseh ben Israel, is that if they came and settled here, this edict would not be used against them. No one would come out and start trotting it and bringing them up to the courts and saying, well, you shouldn't be here because, etc., etc. And that's more or less what happened. Nice little pragmatic British compromise. Now, the Conference of Whitehall, which Manasseh ben Israel was involved in, was in November 1655, which is why we date the resettlement from 1st of January 1656, was when things officially happened. Now, what really happened then was that those Jews who were living as Moranos or Conversos came out of the closet. They established themselves more openly rather than having to practice their rituals secretly, and they built the first synagogue in Britain, which is still standing. It's called Bevis Marks. It's in the city of London. It's quite an interesting monumental building. It suffered about 25 years ago from an IRA bomb blast. It had quite bad damage. It's been restored since then. To be fair to the IRA, they weren't practicing anti-Semitism. They were just practicing anti-Britishism, and Bevis Marks happened to get in the way. It just happened to be near where the bomb went off. It's a wonderful old building. It is worth seeing just on purely historical grounds. My wife is a professional florist, and she's actually done weddings at Bevis Marks, provided the flowers, not taking the ceremonies. And we know it quite well. It's also got a restaurant, which is not bad. We've eaten there before now. It's got a sort of adjunct restaurant, but don't try and go there on Saturdays. They don't open. It's a bit of a nuisance, isn't it? But anyway, Bevis Marks is the oldest synagogue in Britain, and it belongs to the tradition of the Jewish people called the Sephardim. Now, Sephardim is a Hebrew word meaning Spaniard, and the original settlers belonged to the Sephardi tradition because they came from Spain and Portugal, Iberian Peninsula, albeit frequently via Holland, but they belong to that section. It's a little bit sort of historically, it goes back to the destruction of the Second Temple, which we mentioned in Tisha B'Av 70. When the Jews were dispersed out of Judea, Palestine, whatever you like to call it, some of them came across to North Africa, and this is the Sephardim. They came across the North African route and ended up Gibraltar, Spain, Portugal, and became the ancestors of the Sephardi tradition. They merged with people along that way and produced these sort of traditions. Is this working, by the way? Sorry. Meanwhile, those who went the other way across east through what is now Iran, and then up the Black Sea and up through South Russia, and then round to Eastern Europe, they formed what is called the Ashkenazim community, which is what actually Helene and I belong to. Am I doing something wrong? Is this my fault?
It's a bit moody.
You don't think it's anti-Semitic? No. Just a thought. Anyway.